Hi, Melissa.
Hi,
Thank you so much for saying yes to this conversation about collective grief and liberation. I appreciate you being here.
thanks for having me.
So we'll begin with a centering and grounding just to arrive in the space, this virtual space. So you can find a comfortable way to be in your body. And anyone listening or watching can find a comfortable way to be, and you can close your eyes or soften your gaze or focus your eyes on something that is grounding in your space. And then just let your hands rest wherever feels comfortable. And take a moment to turn your attention to your breath and begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And now begin to deepen and lengthen your breath in your body. And take a moment to notice how you feel physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Notice what is present for you at this time. And now bring your awareness to your heart space, your heartbeat, and notice what is present there. Notice what you are holding in your heart. And now bring your awareness back to the breath and take a few more cycles of breath here. And when you feel ready, you can blink open your eyes, just taking a moment to reorient to the space. So I would love for you to share about the work you do in the world.
Thank you. So some of the work I do is with yoga therapy. So I work in group settings, but also one-on-one, and I offer individualized practices for people to find balance, essentially. So with yoga therapy, we focus a lot on not just what's going on in their body, but really how are they breathing? How are they living their life? They might have 4 or 5 chronic illnesses, but really what we want to know is like, how are they functioning in the world? Can they move? Can they breathe? Are they happy? Are there things they need to process? Things like that. So um, me and other yoga therapists, I think that's such important work because, you can go to yoga class, which is so useful and so helpful. But when you're in a group setting, every single person you don't know what people are coming into the room with, right? And, for some people, a group class is what's accessible for them, which is awesome, and there are, as we're talking about grief and liberation, there are so many people. I would argue that almost everyone in a room in a yoga class is probably dealing with some sort of grief or another. And it stems from different things, whether it's generational, whether it's something acute that happened in their life. And so being able to work with people one-on-one to really get some deeper insight into not just how are they feeling right now, but like, where do they really want to go? What direction do they want to go in? And how can we help them get there, essentially? So I do that. And then I also work as a program director for a nonprofit called Yoga Foster, which I love. And it's just a team of 3 of us. And we provide online trainings for educators to bring mindful movement into classrooms all across the country. So we work in every single state, work with about, 3,000, 3,500 educators. And all of it's digital. So that's another way I really love making yoga and movement and meditation really accessible. Most of our teachers come in through our program through scholarships we provide. And we can talk more about that later, but we've just been coming up against a lot of layers of why things haven't been accessible to educators or to educators who work at certain schools or students, and how, they just don't not only have the time, but it's not even on their I don't want to say radar, but it's not even something they feel like is available to them to be well. And that's something that I think a lot of us really take for granted, that we so many of us really have the resources. We might not be accessing it, but we have them. And so many educators we work with, that's something that they really struggle with. So one of my roles at Yoga Foster is to also create a relationship with all of our educators and to create opportunities for them to stay balanced and well so they can do their job, but also so that, they have your job is your job, but you also have your life outside your job, and how to really treat educators as like a whole person and not just somebody who has to get kids to achieve a certain test score. So.
That's exciting work.
Wow.
Thank you for what you do in the world. So as you know, this conversation is about collective grief and liberation, and I'd love for you to share why this is an important conversation, why talk about grief and liberation.
Oh my God, how much time do you have?
I know. We have some time, though.
There's so many reasons. There are so many. A couple of things that stand out to me is I don't really think we have a choice. We have a choice, but we don't really have a choice because it's there whether we choose to deal with it or not. And we're just being touched by grief, I feel like, from every direction these days. And whether it's your own personal grief, we all go through it, transitions in life, family, friends, partners, right? We have our own personal grief, but then we also have grief in our immediate community, things that happen in our community, grief over things not being the way we want them to be. But then we also have our broader communities in our country and all the things that are happening within our country, our political climate and social media. And it's not just that things are happening, it's how we're being touched by them. And it's like constant contact all the time. And then we have all things happening all over the world. And I very much believe the sentiment that my freedom and my wellness, how much does it really mean if other people are suffering? And so I really believe that, but it also can be very overwhelming. So yeah, I think it's really important to discuss the idea of collective grief, the reality of it, because it's around us no matter what, and it affects us in more ways than I think we realize. I think that talking about it at least can make us more present with the work that we do. No matter what work you do, it makes you more present in your relationships. But not talking about can really hinder like your own spiritual growth, because it's just like a burden that we're all carrying with us. And I really believe that, in order to achieve liberation, get to a place where we can be free, we have to process and acknowledge the grief that's there. You can't just like let go of whatever you want to let go of and be free and just pretend like the stuff doesn't exist. So.
And is there, I heard you talk about the importance of talking about it and processing and just elevating a conversation about grief. And how that's connected to liberation. Is there more you want to say about the relationship between grief and liberation?
Yeah, I think there's this idea of, you know, something happens, whether it's to us or around us, but in a way it still affects us. And at least I find sometimes, like with collective grief, there's an uncertainty that's there of not sure like how much of it I can take on, or not sure like how much of it is mine to deal with. Um, and I think having that conversation around just like how it feels to be experiencing what we're experiencing in our communities right now, and the injustices, the racism, the lack of respect for fellow humans, all of that, you know, not respecting facts, right? Just, you know, and I think having a conversation around that can help just bring some clarity around like, okay, this actually affects all of us because we're all, you know, a collective humanity. And it can also bring some clarity on like, but, you know, why is it affecting me in this particular way? Like, what is it triggering for me? You know, maybe, you know, something that might happen in the yoga community might affect me in a really different way than my friend who's not Indian. It might still completely affect her, but it might trigger something else deep inside me that if I'm not acknowledging, I'm not talking about it, that may never come to light. And then I also never really get to acknowledge like, oh yeah, that's actually a really important part of who I am. And that's a really beautiful thing. And so I think it's really important to discuss it, but more so I think talking about it, having these conversations brings things to light. It's like, I feel like with postures, like the physical part of yoga practice, it helps things surface. But your pranayama, your breathing and your meditation, that's really what's helping you digest and process it. So you can't really have one without the others, right? You probably can't sit for an hour and meditate if like you have lower back pain, because you have to do a bunch of stuff to like get some of that out before you sit and meditate. Just same thing with grief liberation. Like you can't feel free and you can't liberate yourself without digesting grief that's there. And I think without having a honest conversation around it, sometimes there's so much of it, it can be really cloudy and not clear.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if you would share some about what lessons grief has taught you in your life.
Okay. I guess one thing that stands out to me, or two things, is I was really, really attached to my grandfather, and he wasn't the most popular person in the family. And now after he passed and my sister talked about how he used to treat her, I can totally see why. But when I was younger, I was just like, I'm the favorite. He loves me. This is so great. And so anyway, we had a really strong relationship, and he passed away about 8 or 9 years ago. And I'm the youngest in the family, and I'm also highly sensitive. And so when he was sick, I remember my mom like not telling me anything because I had a really stressful job at the time, and she just didn't want to like rattle me. And in hindsight, I think I'm the one who probably like was the saddest. And so there's this idea of like protecting your kids or protecting the people around you, which on one hand I really appreciate because I feel like my mom really understood my personality and really honor that. And on the other hand, it was like I didn't have a choice in the matter of what I was able to know and not know. And then when he passed soon after that, and I found out through one of my relatives, I remember just feeling so upset, but more so that like my grief wasn't really accepted in the family. I remember like my grandmother, his wife had passed away several years before, and that was like devastating for the whole family. And my dad was really close to her, so it like brought up a lot of stuff for him. And I feel like we really grieved together collectively as a family, and we really mourned and we really talked about it. And then I feel like a few years later, my grandfather passed away. It was like nobody talked about it at all. And I remember just feeling really sad, but also like the practical part where it's like, my cousin was like, this is the circle of life, you know, and this is just how it is. And we can be sad, but it's okay. And let's like move on. And there was like much more of the Western mentality of like, there's kind of like that timestamp on, okay, we've like talked about it, but let's all move on with our lives. Where I feel like my grandmother passed away. It was like the first big death in our family. And everybody like really like kind of worked together as a group to heal. So one thing I really learned from that was like that even though my family isn't from America, And they're very much, you know, probably before British colonization, there probably was a lot of a collective mentality on grief. And there probably was, like, you know, I know in like Native American tradition, they have all these like rituals for grieving together. And so I imagine, I don't know for sure, but I imagine in Indian culture there may have been that too, and that probably got cleaned out a little bit with Western colonization. But what I noticed was that I would cry, and the first thing my parents would be like, "Don't cry, you have to be strong." And I was just like, "What?" I was like, "But I'm upset," you know? So then there was this like feeling of, you want to feel how you feel, but then you're like, I was the youngest kid. I was like a total people pleaser. I didn't want my parents to ever be upset. And then there was like, okay, but this is my dad. This is my dad's dad. And if he's not that sad, I shouldn't keep bringing it up because then he's going to get sad. So it's immediate, like falling back into your patterns of not only accommodating everybody, but like wanting everyone to just be okay. And there's, again, the whole cycle of like the lack of acknowledgement. You're pushing it down because you're like, it's actually quite self-important in some ways. It's the idea of like pushing it down because you don't want other people to be affected, or you don't want to re-traumatize other people. And that sort of stayed with me for a long time. I remember learning from that. That was the first time I really felt like, wow, that's, if somebody needs to feel something, they need to express, they need to be able to express it. And if you're not the right person for me to do it around, then that's fine. But then I need to have space to go find my group of people to do that with. And I was only like 23 at the time, and I didn't really realize it. But now, you know, my family's so different now, and they would never say that anymore, because now all we do is talk about our feelings. But at the time, it was very much like if you cry, it's because you're weak. And if you don't cry, it's because you're being strong for the family. And you should be happy because he lived a really long life, right? Or you should be happy because not everybody gets to live out their years like that. Or you should be happy because this person was suffering. So it's, what I learned from that is like, dualities can exist, you know, and I think a lot of people know that too, but dualities can exist where you can feel really, really sad about something and like super relieved. And so that was one thing I learned from. The other one, it's like super personal, but I'd love to share it. I just don't know if I'll share it with anybody else, any of my friends or family. But I had an abortion in college, and that was something that was obviously a total accident. I was 20 years old, and I remember like having an abortion and feeling like immediately just like so relieved, just like, oh, it's over. I can like not make mistakes now for the rest of my life, like that sort of mentality. And I never actually like grieved that experience until maybe like 10 years later. And I'm probably still processing that too. And it's, again, that feeling of this, emotions can happen side by side. And that's actually very freeing when we start to think of it that way, that, you know, I can be very relieved because it was an accident. It was like the wrong time. It wasn't what I wanted. And relieved that like I lived in a state at the time that gave me like really great access to healthcare, and I could afford to do something like that because I lived in New York, and just feeling like really grateful for all of those things. And then the other side, it wasn't so much grieving like the loss of like a fetus. It was more grieving of like my innocence in a way, that this is forever going to be a part of my story. And I can never go back and make it something else. And grieving like a mistake you made, grieving like not being responsible enough, like all of those things. And, you know, I feel like I was always told that grief is always about like when you lose someone. And I really just like don't think that's true. I really think that grieving can be a loss of a chapter of your life, a loss of something that like will never be, or a loss of something that you love so much but just doesn't exist anymore because of time. And so I think with my abortion, that was like a huge lesson on grief that I didn't realize then, but the body always remembers. So it like stayed in my body, and I would just have like that. After that, I started experiencing anxiety and like fear of getting pregnant, like all of these things that were irrational in many ways, or I felt that were irrational, but had a very like actually true and very a true and valid root, actually. When I like traced it back with my therapist and with my like meditation and stuff, I would trace it back. I'm like, oh, it's actually no surprise that I feel all of these things, because this thing happened, and the fear of being imperfect, the fear of making mistakes, the fear of going through something again and not being able to deal with it, not being able to grieve and mourn it. So it's a lot of common symptoms of PTSD. But that was a really interesting experience, because when my grandfather passed away, I was like, yep, I'm definitely sad. And you guys are all crazy because you're not letting me be sad. And when this happened, which was only a couple of years before, I was like, oh, I should just be so relieved and I'm so done and great. And I went back to school and everything. And then a couple of years later, I started getting anxiety, and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense, right? So it's, again, this idea of like wanting to be free from an experience, wanting to be free from your grief, but there was so much digestion that needed to happen, no matter how big or small the experience was. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about both experiences. And there's actually someone else who I interviewed who will share, it's not necessarily the same story, but they'll share about getting an abortion as well. And just the experience of as you say, what needed to be digested, right? And how long that took for them. So I appreciate you sharing that story here with me. And I'm just curious, this is not one of the questions I sent you, but I'm wondering about the connection between those two experiences and the lessons you named, and you being a yoga therapist. Like, I can't help but feel like there's a big connection around your life's path and the work you do, and the experiences of grief you just named around, you know, not being able to feel things or wanting to move past feelings. Do you feel like there's a connection between your experience?
Oh yeah, I mean, all the time. I remember a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, my husband and I were supposed to get married in Puerto Rico. And our wedding was like 6 weeks after Hurricane Maria. And so our wedding, of course, got canceled because the devastation was horrible. And it was like, it was actually a big lesson on grief, but it was something I wasn't willing to share because I felt like, oh, that's like so small. It's like just a wedding, you know? And at this point I'd been teaching for like many years. And I had kind of just started working as a yoga therapist at that time, but I had been teaching yoga for a long time. So I was all about like, you know, feeling your feelings, like processing them, letting them come out, finding creative ways to digest them and express them. And when this happened, we were like obviously really upset but it was more like, we were like, we didn't even want to have a big wedding. But then we were like, we know we're not going to get around it. So if we're going to do it, let's do it the way we want to do it. And then we created this whole experience together. And then it got completely taken out from underneath us. And then I remember at the time, my first instinct was right back to my old patterns, where I was just like, okay, yeah, but like people have it so much worse. Like we can deal with letting go of a wedding, we'll figure it out. Which I think is great and noble and all those things, but it wasn't actually true for me. It was just how I was used to operating before I started doing all this work about acknowledging my own patterns and acknowledging my own inherent nature and my tendencies. And so I just remember just being like, yeah, it's okay. Like obviously it really sucks, but it's just a wedding. Like we don't really care. We'll figure out somewhere else to do it. And then we did. And then we decided to reschedule it in Puerto Rico, and it got canceled again. And then we were like, okay, we got it. The universe is telling us like, we're just not supposed to have a destination wedding. His parents offered to plan the whole thing in Memphis, where my husband's from, and which was really nice. But we were basically trying to avoid having like a huge Indian wedding. And then it kind of just, this whole twisted path led us right back to there. So it was this really interesting experience of grief, because it was very much a grief that feels so trivial and small. It doesn't feel big enough to be heard. Feels like people have it so much worse, and some people don't even get to have a wedding at all, and all of these things, right? Blah, blah, blah. And I remember that moment where I could feel like my body being like, if you're not going to acknowledge it, we're just going to do the work for you. Mm-hmm. And I remember just like actually like imploding from the inside. Like I had like really bad IBS. My anxiety was like super high, and it hadn't been for like years. It was super high, and I completely freaked out because I was like, again, like this is not supposed to be what it is. Like I'm supposed to be able to handle this better. I'm a yoga teacher and blah, 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 like the whole story. But it kind of just brought me back to the idea of of grief and being free and like being liberated, because you're like, okay, you just want to like let go of this whole thing because it's kind of inconvenient to feel sad about it. And it's not so bad like a parent dying where like you kind of have to deal with it, right? You can kind of like get around it and just tell everyone like, oh, I'm so much bigger than having a wedding and this and that. But like it wasn't actually true, and I wasn't listening. And so it was just an interesting experience of being now being a yoga therapist, being a yoga teacher, but like you still have those experiences. And after my body basically did that work for me, after a month or two, I was like, okay, yeah, like I just wasn't paying attention. And then I just allowed myself to have that space in my practice and my mentor to just talk about it. And as I was saying it, I was like, oh, this feels so stupid, you know, feels so dumb, you know, like what a privileged thing to be talking about. And she was just saying like, she was saying, tell me as a yoga teacher, she was just like, if you can't acknowledge whether it's small or big, if you can't acknowledge something that really upsets you and you feel hurt about, how can you expect to like inspire other people to do that, I guess, you know? And not to say that we're all perfect ever, but that just like made me think of that when you're like, what's the connection, you know, it's like, I'm not going to be able to do that all the time because I'm a human being. But it was more this like bigger lesson of like, yeah, this fear of being imperfect has actually stayed with me probably since I was a kid. And it's gotten magnified through mistakes and experiences I've had. But it's the whole coming back to like, what are those big patterns that you operate out of? Because we all have them. And our yoga practice is all about layering on new patterns that actually serve us more. So it's not like the fear of being imperfect or the fear of not being able to handle something awful goes away. Like it's still there. But these stronger, newer patterns that serve us more, they get layered on top and they start to become the things we operate out of. So that I still have these things, they just get quieter and more dormant. But they'll never get dormant if I just like pretend they're not there.
Thank you for sharing that, and just your process with not paying attention to grief, and then the body, which it does so many times, right? So much. The body will, it's wise and it will do the work for us if we're not actually consciously going to do the work. Or it will point to what we need to pay attention to, as you know, and for sharing about your connection between the work that you do in the world and just your experience of grieving and processing grief or denying grief and then having to pay attention to it. And I appreciate what you're saying about the example of the wedding and feeling like, oh, that's not a big deal, or what a privileged thing to say. And it's grief, right? Grief is how I think about it, like trauma. I think about trauma the same way. And that part of what culture has made us do is compare these things, which really doesn't allow us to live into our wholeness and heal. It feels like it's the impact of dominant culture, I feel like, around not feeling, right? And it has to be very bad for us to pay attention to it. And and these gradations of grief or trauma, which I don't think serve us to actually be in a conversation like that. Like we can recognize privilege, right? And also honor our feelings.
I always like think about this with how I think about doing my practice every day or almost every day is, and I say this to my clients too, because sometimes, you know, like people will come because somebody recommended to them that like yoga is good, but they're like, well, I don't really have any issues, you know? And it's not like I want something to be wrong with them. That's not what I'm saying, but it's more like we all have stuff. And if we're here to like evolve and basically come closer to what our true nature is, like we all have conditioning and we all have stuff. So they're like, oh, but nothing's wrong. I should only do this if something's wrong. And I always tell them, and I have to tell myself all the time that like, we have to move away from this Western thinking of like being reactive. And as Western medicine is incredibly valuable for so many things. But one place where it is lacking is like in prevention, you know, and in paying attention to something, even when it's small. And my husband's a physician and we talk about this all the time because my background's in public health. And we talk about how like, you know, doctors only have so much time to address all the things. And there are so many reasons why a person is sick and why they're not like changing their habits. And a doctor actually has in some ways, very little control over that because there's so many other socioeconomic factors that makes up a picture of why a person is so unwell, like where they live, how much money they have, how many kids they have, how educated they are, like all of those things, right? So we always talk about this idea of, you know, I always say like, you know, why do we wait until somebody's already like progressed so much to an illness for them to go to a doctor? Whereas in Ayurveda, which is a sister science to yoga, there's a whole model for stages of disease. And then one of my teachers taught us this recently in our yoga therapist training about, you know, there's 6 stages. And a lot of times people don't end up at the Western doctor until they're at stage 4 or 5, to the point where all they can really do is maybe reduce it a little bit. All they can really do is manage it. That's not to say for everybody by any means, but it was just like this example of how, our body gives us signals and we just don't pay attention. But it's not because like we don't necessarily want to. It's like we're not conditioned to do that.
Right.
It's more like, I'm only going to go to the doctor when this has gotten so bad. And then we go and they're like, well, all I can do is help you manage it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much grief that comes with that too. This idea of, I'm only going to take care of something when something's wrong. And then it becomes so big and overwhelming that we grieve this idea of like, oh, had I just done all of these things, then I wouldn't be here. Right. And so I always talk to my clients about like, think of your yoga practice as something that will make you better, even better when you're feeling good. Mm-hmm. It's not something you do just because you feel bad. It's not, it's great if you start to have that awareness of, oh, I'm feeling anxious. Let me lay on my back and do some deep breathing. Awesome. That's a great way to start. But over time, in the long run, like, it's not just used as like an immediate treatment. It's something you do every single day. Like mm-hmm. I said before, to layer on a new pattern, and like you get really good at what you do every day.
Right.
And so if you only treat it as something that I'm going to wait until this grief gets so big, then I'll do all this stuff, is like, we're also not conditioned to like deal with that discomfort either. It's just really interesting. Mm-hmm. It's like a whole perpetual cycle.
It is.
It's hard.
It is, for sure. Yeah. What you're naming about conditioning and layering on new conditioning or patterns is making me think about rituals or practices you might engage to respond to grief or to create space for ease and liberation, however you want to frame this. You mentioned yoga. You've mentioned it a few times, so I imagine that is a practice that you're engaging. And if you could talk some about that, and if there are other rituals or practices you engage to help you move through.
I think aside from a yoga practice, which I can definitely talk about, I think one thing I do to help with grief is finding the right people in my life to have those conversations, like those non-judgmental conversations. I used to not really do that because I didn't want to, seem like I didn't have my shit together. And I wasn't comfortable doing that with my family because I was like, oh, they'll look at me differently. Or if I feel rejected, then I won't want to bring it up ever again. But now I'm much more comfortable talking about some of the things with my parents and my sister. But it's like finding those, even if it's like one or two people in your life, not that you don't go and like mentally dump all your stuff on them, but it's more like, I feel like my anxiety is a little heightened, or I feel like something's really coming up for me. It's like, I write some of it down, I organize my thoughts, but then I have those couple of people to be like, hey, like, do you have a minute to talk? Like, this is coming up for me. Like, and also saying in the beginning, like, I don't want advice, or like, I do want advice, and just being clear about what my needs are in that moment has been super useful because it normalizes it. And I think coming from an Indian culture, there's very much a stigma around mental health and around grief. And to be honest, I don't really have an answer of where that comes from. I don't really know if it's like inherently an Indian thing, or if it's something that is just in the past few generations because of colonization. I actually don't know. And I should really talk to my parents about that, actually. But coming from that culture too, there's a big stigma around it. And, I remember like telling my family, like, I wanted to go to therapy, and my parents were like, they were a little bit confused. They were like, what's wrong with you? But they were never like, oh, you're weird, you shouldn't do that. But I remember some extended family just being like, oh, you really shouldn't tell people that, you really shouldn't, like, you shouldn't advertise it, even though like a bunch of my family are probably going to therapy. And so anyway, having a couple of people I can have those conversations with that can just either soundboard or just listen is really important. I have like a little ritual that I have in the space where I do my practice, where I have just like a couple of pictures up. It's like a little sacred space. I had like a couple of things that from my parents' house before they moved, and a couple pictures of my grandparents, of my music guru, like all kinds of stuff there. And before I start my practice, I kind of just sit and I just look for a moment, and I acknowledge, and just taking into my being something bigger than myself. Having your ancestors to stand on is very helpful. So I really like doing that. I'm not so sure that I really thought about it as a way of dealing with grief, but now that I think about it, it's actually been quite useful. Just to have a support larger than yourself. And, asking them. One of my teachers, every time he does this weekly meditation every week, sometimes there's a theme in the beginning where he just has us close our eyes and he's like, ask for help. He's like, something bigger than you, whether you believe in God or whether it's like your ancestors, whether it's like your soul inside, like ask for help and ask for support before you start your practice. So that's kind of my way of doing that. Yeah. And then the other way through my yoga practice, I have a mentor. And so again, it's the idea of like working as a collective. And it's very relieving not to have to decide your own practice every day. I don't think that people should. I think everyone should have a teacher or mentor that's like seeing them as like through an unbiased lens, and can give you a practice that moves you in a direction you need to go in. So I work with her a lot. And that's super helpful because as she includes things in my practice to help me digest things, my physical digestion, but also like emotional digestion. And that's super helpful because it is, like I said, it brings stuff up to the surface.
Yeah.
But then your meditation is there to help you, like, to help it settle. But just knowing that, like, the whole thing it's like a lifelong process, and I think we talked about this before we started the call, but, you might, with your grief, you might process one thing and then, you kind of like let it go. And then all of a sudden that like layer gets like an onion, that layer gets stripped off. And then another really painful thing comes up and you're like, what? I thought I was done with that. And then you work with that for a little bit, it comes off. And it's just sometimes with certain experiences, like with the abortion, like you might have to do it like 100 times before you get to that last time for at least that phase of like, oh, I feel at peace with this, So it's really having the patience, and we can't rely on ourselves for everything. We can't rely on ourselves to have all the patience and all the knowledge and all the positivity and all the support. Like that would be exhausting. And so it's so important to have a village of people that can not only see you for who you are, but can can offer you practices to help move through these things.
Yeah, I love the idea of having a mentor to help guide you in your practice. And as you said, someone who can see you and which direction where you might need to go, and they can help support that. I love that idea and that question or that meditation and invitation of asking for help too.
Yeah.
And that being a sort of from ancestors, from spirit, from the natural world, wherever, right? But asking for help because we do need support.
Yeah, I think like being in nature is super useful too. And a lot of people probably utilize that. Not so much because it's like calming and stuff, but because like it's having that feeling of awe again. And I think when you go through grief again and again and again, whether it's like personal grief, whether it's like grief of what's happening in our community, which has been incredibly depressing recently, and just feeling like I feel like there's actually nothing I can do. And there's something I can really do to change it. I can only work on myself and like impact the people around me. That's like all I can really do. And I don't even have control over like what the people around me do, but it's going to these places where you can have that feeling of awe again, that like, oh, there's something in this world that like, can bring back that feeling of wonder, of curiosity, of like innocence again, when you feel like that just doesn't exist anymore. So that's been really useful for me.
Yeah. I love that. The curiosity and awe, like, and wonder, and that the natural world does provide that. And I've also thought about it as at times when the world has not made sense to me, the natural world has like made sense to me because there's an order to things. And even if I don't fully understand it, which I don't, but I can see this leads to that, or this is in relationship with that tree over there, or this being is connected to this plant. So it's been helpful to see some sort of natural order because things feel very disordered and dysfunctional right now. Yeah.
And I love that you said that about there is an order, but I don't always understand it. And it's just kind of for me, it goes back to the idea of like, we don't necessarily need to, but the pattern for so many of us is like, we want to understand everything. And we think a lot of times, like my experience with myself and a lot of people I work with is we think like, once I understand this and like everything will be clear. But once I understand this too, then it'll all be clear and this will go away. And there's some truth to it. I think with anxiety, it's like when you can name it and you put it out there, I think it helps so much because you're like, oh, right, I'm not crazy, or, like everyone goes through this, right? I think there is truth to that, but with grief, can be so many layers to it. And it's just, you don't have to know all the whys. Like you just have to know like what's the next right thing to do. And then like if you're doing a practice or, you know, something regularly that keeps you like connected to yourself, then like that next right thing will be like revealed to you like again and again and again, but not because you're chasing it, because you're putting your energy into your practice. And I really believe that. And there's in yoga philosophy, we read like the Yoga Sutras, which is by Patanjali, and you're probably familiar with it, but there are all these aphorisms that are incredibly powerful, but also really interesting because they can interpret it in so many different ways. But there's one in particular that I always think about with like with collective grief, and it's one of the definitions is with continuous effort or with continuous practice, that which needs to be revealed to you will, or that which needs to be relinquished will be revealed to you. And what's so interesting about that is like, he's really saying like, don't put your attention on all the things you have to let go of. He's really talking about collective grief and liberation now that I think about it. He's not saying like, go and liberate yourself, like go focus. He's like, no, like focus on your practice, whether it's like work, going to therapy or like whatever it might be, your yoga practice, whatever it is, like focus on your practice, put your energy there, be consistent, make sure you like your practice. Make sure you like, you know, you have some guidance, like all of those things. And then as you do that, your energy is going there. And then what needs to be let go of, it will just come. And it will come without much effort, because you're placing your energy somewhere else, which is on your practice. And you're not placing your energy on like, but I have to let this go. And I remember you talking about how you do anti-racism work. And that makes me think of like, when we have a collective community where we can really talk about that and process that, I think that's one way to have a practice that really helps the relinquishing to happen. Because you have a space to do that. Whereas if you just sat there by yourself and you're like, well, I have to let go of all of this anger because it's not helping me. It's like, sure, that would probably be really useful, but like, it's not that easy. And it would be exhausting if that's what we had to do all the time.
Yeah, I hear a lot in a lot of your answers, there's a connection to community. And of course, this is called Healing in Community, this summit, but like a lot of a connection with, I need to do this in space with others. Of course, you're doing your practice and you're grieving on your own too. And you're naming the importance of being in community as we grieve and letting things surface and then being witnessed in that, which, I mean, that's not what I learned about grief. I learned to grieve behind closed doors or not at all. And so I really hear what you're offering as an antidote to what culture has taught many of us about how we should grieve, or if we should grieve, or whether or not we should express feeling. And that's making me think of this question about prioritizing grief. So what might it look like? And community is one of the ways I've heard you name it, but what might it look like for this culture? And when I say culture, I'm really talking about dominant culture, knowing there are other cultures, right? I'm naming the things that feel really toxic. So what might it look like for us to prioritize grief and liberation? What could that look like?
Good question. I think one of the first steps would be an acknowledgement of the needs people feel like aren't being met. I think that's a really big one. And I think my ideal world, you have a group of like 100 people that all like believe really different things and all probably hate each other for what they believe. We put them all in a room and everyone goes one by one and says like the top 3 needs, like they feel like, or I feel this because I'm not meeting this need, you know? And I really think that's like, for me, like that's what that would look like, because when people put that out there, everyone also sees like, oh, we're all just trying to meet needs. Everything everybody does is trying to meet a need, whether it's helpful or not, right? And so putting that out there and people being able to voice that also makes us realize like, yeah, like we're all probably trying to meet the same needs. We all want to be safe. We all want to be heard. We all want to feel like our community is a place we want to live in. You know, we want like our kids to be healthy and happy. We want the best healthcare. We want the best education. Like who doesn't want that, you know? And these are just to name a few, right? And then there are probably deeper, more cultural, ancestral ones too. But yeah, I think that's like what that would look like for me to start with, is like being able to have that conversation without anything attached to it, you know, without any opinion attached to it either, just like putting it out there for what it is. And then getting an insight into like, you know, we're human beings. Like we all have needs and we're all trying to meet them. And a lot of them are probably similar, but now we're just going about them all really different ways. And some hurt each other more than others. But I think if we put that out there and people got to be seen for who they are versus only what they believe, it'd be really useful. And I have a really, really, really hard time with that. Like I have a really hard time having a conversation with someone who supports like the current politics. And, you know, my husband does too, but he's much better about being like, yeah, but they still have all these things to their personality that you really love. And I'm just like, I don't care. Like, how could you have a conversation with me? I'm like a brown person, blah, 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 story. Like, how could you believe these things and still expect me to talk to you? And I have I have a hard time admitting that, but like, it's true. But because I really think that way and I'm like trying to work on dismantling that, like, how can I actually have a real conversation with anybody else who might be grieving as well, just maybe for a totally different reason? It's really hard for me to, because then it gets to the story of like, well, now it's a competition of whose suffering is the worst. And I really think that social media in some ways is so great, but I think it's really amplified that. It's kind of decided, like you were saying before, is this had this comparison or deciding, somehow we've decided like what the right amount of grief is to share, what the right amount of suffering is to share. And if it's not that much, then we shouldn't be sharing it. It gets into this pretty bad cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's an acknowledgement that, I mean, each one of us is suffering, and I think what you're naming about staying in relationship with people that may be causing harm, like that's a challenge, right? For many people, it's a challenge for me too. And it's a practice to try to figure out how to do that. It's where I really engage my spiritual practice to stay grounded, and to try to center connection and relationship, knowing that, as you named earlier, each one of us has been conditioned in some way. So sometimes I'm like, oh, this is this person's conditioning, and that's what allows me to stay in relationship. And other times I'm like, I can't actually talk to you, right? Like,
that's probably my experience more than the other
right.
times. And I just, that's my own, I don't like to think of it as like, well, that's my own stuff and I have to deal with it. And part of that is true. And part of that is like, well, no, maybe sometimes I don't have to deal with it, right? And sometimes that's part of protecting yourself and protecting your grief.
Mm-hmm.
Is like, I don't have to just, you also get to choose when you volunteer that to anybody, which is why like, I really love having like a couple of people in my life that I can like soundboard with, that like, remember Susanna posted this thing on her social media a while back, and it was like, you don't deserve the privilege of like my vulnerability, or like, you don't get to demand the privilege of my vulnerability. And that's what that made me think of, yeah, there are times where you're like, okay, I'm in a relationship with this person. They were just conditioned to think this way, just like I have my own conditioning, and that's fine. And there are some times where it's like, well, no, you don't get to just have it just because like you should, or I should, right? It's like and I think your practice is super helpful for like developing that clarity and discernment of, I'm like involved in this whole community now of South Asian yoga teachers, and we talk about cultural appropriation and ways to dismantle it, ways to educate, the white yoga community and studios and stuff. And it's like incredibly hard work because you come up against all of your crap. And even I remember doing an interview one time, and I remember like, I could see myself doing it, of like defending white people somehow, and I got off the call and I texted her. I'm like, did I just really do that? And she's like, yeah, but it's okay. It happens all the time. Like, we all do it because like, even though we feel this way, it's so deep seated us to please like the dominant culture, especially as like immigrants or children of immigrant parents. Like, your need for assimilation is like so high. So it's like, I'm trying to meet that need. So even though I really like believe this one thing, I'm like, oh, but I don't want to lose all my clients. Like, let me say this stuff too. When it's like, well, if we actually show up as like what we believe and what we feel like is important, it might close the door to like a bunch of people, but it might open the door to like so many more people that are like, oh my God, thank you for being real. Thank you for saying that I've been waiting for a teacher here to have that conversation. So but like you said, it's like, we get to choose when that is. It's not like once you open the door, you can never close it. I can close it like whenever I want, actually. Right. And so it's pretty interesting.
I mean, boundaries are important. So that's part of what I hear. Can you share some about what, and you did at the beginning, about what collective liberation means to you, what it looks like? Sort of, it's similar to the question or the framing of what would it look like to prioritize a space for people to grieve collectively, what would it look like if we came to a place of collective liberation?
I think I think one thing that needs to happen, or what that would look like, is a respect for our ancestors. And an acknowledgement too. It's not just like respecting everything, it's acknowledging like, yeah, maybe some of us have ancestry that like did some really messed up stuff. And though we might not have done any of that kind of stuff in our lifetime, like it's still a part of our culture because we've descended from that. And there's definitely an acknowledgement that needs to happen. And I don't think you can really do that and like be liberated. I don't think you cannot do that and be liberated is what I mean. I just don't think that. I mean, yeah, I was going to make a Frozen 2 reference, but maybe I'll do that offline because it was all about colonialism and indigenous culture and like righting the wrongs of your ancestors. But it's, you know, I think I really respect when I hear white people, you know, say like, yeah, like our ancestors did some really messed up shit. They really did. And I can't make that go away, but I can really look at my lens and how I see communities and where my biases are. And like, I can at least talk about it. And I think that's super important, you know, like my family's from India, cousins from families from India. And we were just talking to his grandmother recently about, she's our only grandparent that's alive. And she lived like during independence, and she lived like when Gandhi was fighting for independence and the British was still in rule. And like, we would talk to her about that. And it's just, you know, we often like talk about like Indian culture as like, you know, they were colonized and it's really bad and they suffered so much. And it's like, it's true. And we also talked about with her about like, there's so much like anti-Muslim sentiment amongst Indian people too, you know, and that our grandparents, like, you know, some of our grandparents might have been really anti-Muslim, or their parents, and how much harm like they might have caused or how much they've contributed to. So it's, even though like our culture has been really suppressed and oppressed in so many ways, like there are also things that like our ancestors have done that like are not cool, you know. And how can I say like, how can we achieve liberation as a community if we're not acknowledging that like, yeah, like some of this stuff happened, but like we need to evolve and grow from that. But we can evolve and grow and just pretend like it didn't happen. So I think that's a big part of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear like acknowledging and naming and a connection with ancestors and reckoning with history so that we can heal, right, and be in community moving forward. I would love for you to share about any work coming up in 2020 that you want folks to know about, any things you're working on, any things you're connected to, communities, anything you want to share about what's coming up.
So one thing I have coming up is I'm doing a retreat in the spring in a couple of months. It's a Seven Springs retreat out in the Smoky Mountains. And it's going to be all of my retreats. I just started my first one last year, but they'll all be yoga therapy retreats. They're like really nourishing. Most important thing is that they're accessible for all bodies and everybody. So I'll be doing yoga therapy and Ayurveda retreat in the spring. And I'll also be doing yoga therapy and astrology retreat with a friend in the fall, probably in Asheville and like the mountains as well. So that's super exciting if anybody's interested in learning more about that. And I think a big part of my work this year is going to be finding a way to integrate honoring yoga, educating people on cultural appropriation, how to still be connected to a yoga practice, but in a more authentic way, I guess. And a big part of that for me is like teaching some of the language that yoga comes from, which is Sanskrit. And not that I'm a Sanskrit scholar, but teaching chanting, teaching pronunciation, like simple things people can do to really respect the tradition versus like pretending like that's just not a part of it. So it's a big part of my work this year. I know some people have expressed interest in learning more about that, so it's pretty cool. But yeah, I'll be leading a teacher training with 2 other teachers in Nashville in March, and we do a lot of work on inclusivity and diversity in yoga and culture appropriation as well. So that'll be a lot of my work, like threaded through everything throughout the year, but those are a few big things that are going on.
Mm-hmm. That's exciting, all of the things you're bringing forward and offering. So thank you again for the work you do in the world, and thank you for saying yes to this conversation today. I really appreciate you and appreciate what you shared with me and with all the folks that will listen to this or watch this. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.